Happy last day of Douglas Week. Happy Black History Month in the US. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. We'll just wait one more minute so that everyone can come in. Loads of wonderful people joining us for our final Douglas Week event. So we'll just give it a minute. See lots of people coming in. Good evening, everyone. Happy Douglas Week. It's great to be with everyone tonight. We'll give it another minute. I see more and more people coming. It's so wonderful. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Happy Douglas Week. We'll wait one more minute before we kick things off for our last event in this event series. So we'll give it another few seconds. I see more people coming in. Okay. Wonderful. While people take their virtual seats, we'll start. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. A very warm welcome from everyone here at the Douglas Week team. I'm here with my wonderful colleagues and friends and co-organizers, Sarah McCready, Dr. Tim Groenland, Kristen Leary, and myself, Dr. Caroline Schroeder. So a very warm welcome to you all. We're delighted to welcome you one last time to Douglas Week this evening. Happy Valentine's Day to everyone. Happy birthday, Frederick Douglass. Happy American Black History Month, and happy last event of Douglas Week. It's hard to believe we've come to the end of this incredible week. Well, Frederick Douglass visited Ireland over 176 years this year. And we've been celebrating and commemorating what he called his transformative journey to Ireland. We've commemorated and honored that this week. The last few days have seen so many inspirational and creative and insightful events. And we've seen such an extraordinary range of events. We've heard many voices. We've seen so many emotions. And before we close out Douglas Week tonight, we'd just like to welcome you to this Our Strong Women conversation. I'm so honored to be in the company of such exceptional women tonight. Before we start this event, just a few last items of housekeeping. For those of you who have joined us for some of the other events will know this by now, but there is a small Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. You can submit your questions there. We'd love to hear from you. Be curious, ask questions, and our team here will be monitoring the Q&A box and will pass on your questions and comments to the speakers. We ask everyone to please be respectful to our panelists. Also, for your information, this session is being recorded and we're live on YouTube, so welcome everyone viewing us on YouTube. And this recording will also be available on our Douglas Week YouTube channel, so you can rewatch it there. And it's now my great pleasure to hand over to the wonderful Kristen Leary from the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. Kristen, thank you.
Thanks, Caroline, and thanks to the rest of the Douglas Week team, and thanks to everyone for joining us here tonight, this afternoon. Just briefly, as Caroline mentioned, over the course of this last week, Douglas Week, we've had so many conversations about the many strong women in Douglas's life. Anna Murray Douglas, of course, but also the abolitionists, both in Britain and across the UK and British Isles, and in America, who supported him and influenced how he and empowered him to do what he did as an activist. So it's really fitting to be ending the week with a focus on women, especially on Frederick Douglass's chosen birthday of Valentine's Day. As an enslaved person, Frederick Douglass did not know his own birthday. He was not certain of it. He thought that it was sometime in February. So he chose Valentine's Day, February 14th, in honor of his mother. He knew he didn't know his mother well, but he knew that she had called him her little Valentine. So we're really pleased to be with you on Valentine's Day and Frederick Douglass' birthday. We're also honored to have these inspirational and remarkable women with us here tonight, including a remarkable woman to help lead us in conversation. And she is Dr. Suzanne Lynch. Suzanne, thank you again, Suzanne, for being here and for making time to be with us and lead us in conversation tonight. Dr. Suzanne Lynch is the Washington, D.C. correspondent for the Irish Times. And prior to her posting in Washington, she was a European correspondent and also has worked as a financial journalist for the Irish Times. And she's covered both domestic and international business news. She's also written extensively on British and Irish media and arts and cultural issues. She holds a BA from University College Dublin and a PhD in English literature from Cambridge University. And as mentioned, she currently covers US politics from Washington, D.C. and is a regular contributor on radio and TV. We know she's been extremely busy in Washington this past week and these past few months. So again, we're especially grateful that you're able to be here with us tonight, Suzanne, and lead this panel of inspirational women in conversation.
Thank you, Chris. And before we hand over to Suzanne now, I just want to introduce the video that we're about to watch before Suzanne starts the conversation. So Frederick Douglass believed in voicing the unspoken. And the team of the Dialogue Code have been gathering voices of both women and men on both sides of the Atlantic, creating a world where everyone can thrive. These times require dialogue, conversation, truth, and collective clarity. So together, I believe we can challenge the status quo. And we'll now watch a short video message from the Dialogue Code. Thank you so much.
We're noticing and what people are saying to us and why this process has been created is because somewhere along the line the system is failing the humans. Somewhere along the line, risk assessments and compliance and insurance and all the systems that operate inside corporations are replacing the humanity that's needed for people to thrive. How can we place people's well-being and their families' well-being at the center of people's work days? So that's some of the conversations that we've been having. And the absence of it has been, high burnout, people sacrificing their families in order to work, particularly with high-level and like C-suite execs, women returning after having children. There's no barrier, there's no entry place back into the workplace at the level that they want to work at and that they're able to work at.
You know you have a cultural problem when it keeps recurring. And we've lots of those.
If you're not curious, you'll settle for the status quo. And the status quo is not the right place to be. So you must be curious to see how you can change that.
You know, we say we're all about integrity. What do we really mean by that? And do we honestly really live that? What do we mean by responsibility? You know, what do we mean by being ethical? What do we mean by being respectful? And all these words are written into, you know, statements of values and hung in the lobby, but they're only an ornament. They're never taken down, deciphered, and translated into systems and behavior. You need to codify your values, name them, but then systematically breathe life into them. How do you do that? Through dialogue.
Frederick Douglass led the way by showing us the power of truth and dialogue. Come, join us at thedialoguecode.com.
Hello, everyone, and you're very welcome to this closing panel of Frederick Douglass Week. I'm just going to briefly introduce the panelists and then just get this conversation going with a few thoughts. So we're joined today by an illustrious panel, as I say, and we have Nettie Washington Douglass, who is a great-great-granddaughter of Frederick Douglass, but she's also a descendant of Booker T. Washington, who's a hugely influential figure in the United States in the whole area of African-American education, social policy. etc. So thanks for joining us, Nettie. Dr. Mary Robinson, you will all be familiar with, a former President of Ireland, also a former UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, Special Envoy on Climate Change. She's currently Chair of the Elders. We have Lord Mayor Hazel, who was the first Irish-born person of Chinese descent in a political office, really, in the island of Ireland. So very welcome, and we're delighted to be joined by Hazel, Lord Mayor, today. We also have a novelist, Emma Dabiri. Her book, Don't Touch My Hair, has been really well received. It was first published in 2019. She's an author and broadcaster. And finally, Dr. Ebun Joseph, who is an academic at UCD. She was born in Nigeria and moved to Ireland in 2002, I believe, and she is also joining us today. So just to kind of get the conversation going, I think it's pretty apt that we're having this final discussion, I think, in this virtual forum, like so much else in our world today, we were forced to, but I think it's quite interesting. I'm speaking to you here from Washington, DC, where just a couple of miles away is the house of Frederick Douglass, where he died, where he spent the last few years of his life, and it overlooks Washington. And Nettie is joining us from Atlanta, Georgia. That has obviously got such strong connections with the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and indeed more recently here with the protests over racial injustice last summer here. And then, of course, everybody joining us from all over the place, particularly in Ireland. And I think it kind of encapsulates the themes of transatlantic connections, historical memory that have been running through this whole week, and what we can all learn and we can all listen to between countries, between continents, even over decades and centuries. So with that, I think I'm going to begin tonight's discussion with Nettie. So welcome, Nettie. And look, maybe you just start us off by talking a little bit about how you first heard about this Irish part of this sojourn, if you like, in Frederick Douglass's life, and how you began to learn about that.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. It's a pleasure to be with you and with the panel. And I will just say I second everything Carol said about happy Valentine's Day, happy everything, happy birthday to my great-great-grandfather. How it started. I grew up knowing that I was a descendant for both Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass. I can't tell you exactly what I learned. I don't remember who sat me down and told me. I know as early as 2 years old, I've seen a picture of myself doing an event. So at some point they had to share it. I had the good fortune of spending my summers every summer with my grandmother Douglass in Frederick Douglass's summer home on the eastern shore of Maryland. Unfortunately, the men in my life died very early. I did not know my grandfather Joseph, who was Frederick Douglass's grandson. Had I known him, I would have gotten firsthand stories because they were very close. My grandfather was one of 6 children, but he was the only one who lived to be an adult. Frederick Douglass had 21 grandchildren, but just a handful lived to be an adult. So since I didn't have that firsthand knowledge, whenever you see Frederick Douglass with a young man, especially a violin, that's my grandfather Joseph. Since I didn't know him, I refer to having first person once removed, and that was my grandmother Douglass, Fanny Douglass. And we spent many an hour, and I have to admit that often I would rather have gone out to play. But she told me as much as she knew from my grandfather. And there are times that I try to channel her. Maybe I'm thinking about getting hypnotized to recall some of the information. But she spent an awful lot talking, and that's where I learned about his trip to Ireland and the importance of his trip to Ireland. I happen to I have Irish ancestry that comes from my Nettie on my mother's side, Nettie #1. My grandmother's grandfather was Irish, O'Connor. So I have a great-great-grandfather. And I was told that very early on as well. But as far as Frederick Douglass and his journey to Ireland, it was life-changing for him. And I know, people can read his accounts and whatnot, but when I was told, I do remember coming to tears at one time when it dawned on me that Frederick Douglass had to leave his country to go to another country. Fortunately, it was Ireland, to be treated as a human, to be recognized as a man and not by his color, to be able to walk down the streets of Ireland and not have to turn over his shoulder, wondering if a slave catcher is coming behind him. Having men that didn't even know him yet walk up to him, look him in the eye, shake his hand, call him Mr. Douglass. And I made a promise, my first trip to Ireland. I won't go into the lengthy part of this, but I am so grateful to all Irish, certainly those that met Frederick Douglass while he was there, that allowed him for the first time in his life to be felt and treated as though he were a man and not because he was an enslaved person or a color, because he was a runaway slave. So from the bottom of my heart, I thank everyone who's listening of Irish descent for your ancestors treating my ancestor like a human being.
That's a lovely sentiment, Nettie, really is. And your own history of your own Irish ancestry is so interesting, because here in the United States, there's now a real movement by the Department of Foreign Affairs and other bodies here to try and encourage more African-American people in this country to look back through their ancestry and find those Irish links, because they were there. And it's becoming a very fascinating thread of Irish American identity, which, like so many parts of Irish identity, has been white for so long. Actually, there's a whole other story there. So that's really interesting. I'm going to bring in Dr. Mary Robinson now. Mary, maybe we'll just get your thoughts, just to start us off, on Frederick Douglass, how you encountered him and your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Suzanne. And I'm really very glad to take part in this closing session of Douglass Week with such an interesting and inclusive group of women. I really look forward to our discussion together, and I have a feeling that we will actually find a lot of common ground. I'd like to share briefly a personal experience, a personal memory. When I was invited by President Clinton to make a state visit as President of Ireland to the United States, I knew that this would be an opportunity to promote some values. As a non-executive president, and I hope it's understood by those in the United States, President of Ireland is not the same as President of the United States. It's a non-executive presidency. I was aware that my power was not in taking policy decisions which would make a difference, but rather in exercising a moral authority, which would flow and often be central to the use of symbols. Symbols are really important when you're exercising moral authority. So when I realized I was going to be making this visit in June 1996, I had asked that a visit to the home of Frederick Douglass would be included. It's now a national historic site at 1141 W Street, because everyone covers, the Irish press would cover the visit of the president, the press from the United States would cover it. So it was a great opportunity to speak to his values. And I had been reading about him, thinking about him quite a bit, especially because I've been very impressed reading about this former slave who achieved so much in his life. And then the fact that his visit to Ireland, which has already been referenced by Nettie, was in 1845, just as our great famine, our Gurtha Mór, was beginning. And this was relevant to the 150th anniversary of marking the famine that I was very engaged in as president. I had already unveiled various monuments in the United States and all over the world during this 150th, 3 years, 1845, 1846, 1847. And the 150th was a very special anniversary. When I went to the house itself, I think it was called Cedar Hill. It was a fine house on good grounds and very nicely placed in a high location overlooking the city of Washington. But what kind of struck with me at the time, interestingly, was that to get there, to travel there, I actually went through a much poorer and much blacker part of Washington than I saw at any other time during the state visit. The rest of it was very white and very different. But this was an interesting, even the journey to the house was interesting because it was just that little bit different. And of course, I was very conscious of the role that Frederick Douglass had played in the women's suffrage movement in the United States. His visit to the Seneca Conference, the fact that he was the only African-American spokesperson there, that he eloquently spoke, that he was so supportive of women's suffrage. And that too, I wanted to draw attention to for the Irish audience who mightn't know, but also for the American audience, for both, because that's what the president can do. When you're president of a country, people follow what you do, believe it or not. I think President Trump understood this in some obscure way, but anyway, people do follow you. And this was an opportunity to symbolize the values that Frederick Douglass stood for. And it was such a pleasure and an honor to do that. And I just want to say that I feel it's extraordinary how relevant all of the issues he stood for are today in the 21st century. They are all here on the table. COVID has made them all real. COVID is a mirror exacerbating all of the inequalities, racial inequality, gender inequality, poverty inequality, and the intersectionality between those inequalities. And I'm sure we'll talk about that.
Great, thank you very much for that. You're absolutely right. Just it's interesting here in Washington, where you saw that other side of Washington, because people think of the US Capitol and the White House, and this is a majority Black city. And that was why the election of Barack Obama on that level was such a huge moment. Or Kamala Harris, who attended a historically Black university in the city. But it is essentially a city that's still segregated in many ways. That, most people who live in the northwest of Washington never go over to Anacostia, where the Frederick Douglass house is, and it's majority Black and it's poor. So it's a really interesting point. Just before I move on to the other panelists, just what I would like, maybe Nettie, you would be good on this, just to maybe let's just briefly touch on the Daniel O'Connell connection. I know people on this call, a lot of people might be familiar with that, but just, Frederick Douglass spent 4 months in Ireland, and he, it coincided obviously with the beginnings of the famine, but also he met Daniel O'Connell, the great liberator. Nettie, could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yes, as a matter of fact, that's one of the reasons he actually went to Ireland. He had written his first autobiography in 1845, and it became a bestseller. And he was still a fugitive slave. So it was suggested that he might want to get out of the country until things kind of quieted down. And he and the abolitionists, they knew of Daniel O'Connell. And it was suggested to go over there and hopefully maybe you can meet him. That Daniel O'Connell was his hero. And he was able to meet him. And I believe, as I remember, Daniel O'Connell even invited him up on the stage to speak. And it was Daniel O'Connell that encouraged Frederick Douglass to go back home and continue the work. He was becoming, or had become, a little disillusioned. I'd been gone for 2 years, and Daniel O'Connell told him to go home and agitate. And I learned that when I was there. We know that Frederick Douglass, one of his famous comments is, quote is, agitate, agitate, agitate. Well, I learned when I was in Ireland that Daniel O'Connell actually just said agitate. Frederick Douglass went home and added too, just like he added an S to his name. He liked to add things. So yes, it was a very, very, very important visit for him in Ireland. And I have to say, if I may, at this time, my first visit, I had the good fortune, just by, I won't say by chance, because I think everything happens for a reason, but of meeting Daniel O'Connell's great-great-granddaughter, Anne Quinlan, on my first visit. Yes, so. And even President Obama mentioned when he was there 2 weeks after my son and I were there that that the descendants of the American abolitionist and the Irish liberator had rekindled the friendship 166 years after they had met. So that was a very special time, yes.
Yeah, fascinating. Thanks for that, Nettie. And, you know, as you mentioned there, Daniel O'Connell, you know, made a speech, you know, he was obviously the great orator, but he really took it upon himself. He took an interest in the plight of slavery, of slaves in the United States at that time. And his idea of human rights and equality was not just constrained to Ireland and the whole issue of Catholic emancipation, etc. But that position was actually quite controversial. You know, there was in America, as some of the Irish American community, right through the Civil War, not all, but some, particularly in the church, you know, didn't want to be on the side of abolitionism, was warning O'Connell against it, because even though the Irish, you know, there was certain competition in certain parts of American society between the Irish and recently freed slaves after the Civil War for jobs. So it wasn't a politically popular stance to take in some ways, but it showed that O'Connell saw the bigger picture, and he saw the principles at stake here, and he fought. He was an abolitionist himself, so very interesting.
Yeah, one thing, if I may add, that I learned that Daniel O'Connell, if he were to meet an American man, before he extended his hand, he would ask, "Are you a slave owner?" And if the person said yes, he did not acknowledge. But if they said no, then he would extend his hand and say, "Very happy to meet you." So I thought that was, I learned that there as well. I thought that was said quite about his character.
Certainly, certainly. I'm just going to bring in the other panelists now, and maybe Lord Mayor Chu, we might just start with you now. Look, I don't know, a lot of people, you mightn't have known much about Frederick Douglass. I mean, it was this, you know, but you've spoken a lot about your own experience as an Irish-born woman of Chinese descent, and some of the challenges you've had with around racism. And, you know, when you read or when you're hearing about this connection that was made of Frederick Douglass, somebody who was so passionate about his cause, and, you know, against all odds, as Mary Robinson described there, came to such fame and power by the end of his life. You know, how does it make you feel? Do you think there are parallels to what's happening now, for example, in Ireland?
There's definitely parallels. Hi, everyone, and thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. It's funny that there was a couple of things running through my mind when Nettie spoke there. Firstly, I'm in awe of her family's history, but also the fact that she mentioned her great-grandfather just likes adding extra S to the name. There's a motion in Cork City's Council. This might sound tangential, but there's a motion in Cork City Council that wants to change one of the streets to honour Frederick Douglass. And there's already a Douglass Street. It's actually by Lorna Bogue that put in the motion. And there's already a Douglass Street. So by adding an extra S, we can commemorate him forever in Cork. So it was, when she said S to the name, I was like, oh, well, that's an easy one to do. I'm sure we can do. But in relation to Frederick Douglass and the history and the parallels, it's funny because next to this office here is the dining room where Frederick Douglass dined, and where he had come and spoke with Daniel O'Connell, and they shared kind of they shared experiences in history. And I had a moment a couple of weeks ago where, and Ebun might speak to this, but there's been different issues at play in Ireland when it comes to racism, when it comes to discrimination, when it comes to division. And there was a moment a couple of weeks ago where I sat in that dining room, the very table where Frederick Douglass had sat before, and I actually cried because it was that moment in me where I thought, will it be better for my daughter in future? So obviously when my mum came over 40 odd years ago, she was one of handful of Chinese immigrants into the country at the time. And for her, there were sporadic incidences of racism, but not constant, sporadic. So, but because she was also a woman as well, it was harder. And I think having this panel called Strong Woman is very apt, because women do have to be stronger. You have a former president here who quite rightly said that women were the ones who, instead of rocking the cradle, or the ones who rocked the cradle now rock the system. So we have always been the ones who kind of stood up to stuff. And even in especially during pandemic, we have noticed that women are the carers. Women are the ones who sometimes are left behind. So that moment when I sat there and cried, I was thinking, would it be better for the women in future? But also, would it be better in particular for women of color in future? Because my daughter looks exactly like me. So the reason why I got into politics was to build a better future for her. The reason why my mom worked so hard when she first got over here and worked as a dishwasher to build a life was because to build a life for me. And the changes from her, I guess, lifetime of racism to now is that it's increased, and we can't deny that, be it through different medium, be it true that there's more of a connection between people and on how they interact and communicate. There is an increase in racism, and unfortunately, until we get that in check, I just have this fear that the work that Frederick Douglass and all the other parties have built over the decades that has passed will be in vain. And this is why panels like this is so important. This is why talking about these issues is so important, because we either try to deal with it now or we'll be lost to it forever.
That's a very sobering thought, Hazel, like the idea that it hasn't improved much. And Ireland, of course, is only in one generation, we've become more diverse, but it's still very new. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I know you've spoken about your own experiences quite recently on online platforms with racism, which arguably is making, giving people another avenue that they didn't have 40 years ago when your mother arrived. Maybe Emma, you might come in on this. This central issue that Hazel raised there about racism in Ireland, basically, and discrimination. I mean, how do you feel as a mixed race person in Ireland, and how would you characterize it, and what are the challenges you faced?
So I live in the UK now, and I have lived here since I finished school. I think because of my experiences growing up, and I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. So this was before there had been the, as you said, Ireland has become more diverse in one generation. This was before the migration that has resulted in that diversity. So I was very much an outlier, shall we say. And because of the experiences and the discrimination, I guess, and the isolation that I felt, and the constant kind of denials of my Irishness, I had lived in the States. I had spent time in Atlanta, actually, where Nettie is. I had spent time in far more diverse and far Blacker environments, and I always felt that as soon as I finished school, that I would that I'd leave, which is what I did, and I've lived abroad ever since. I mean, I have very much rehabilitated my relationship with Ireland on a personal level, and it's been fascinating for me to see the demographic changes that have happened. They were ones I would never have anticipated, and I always find it quite interesting that it was around the time I left that the country actually started to get more diverse. So if I had just held on for a few more years, I might have been okay, and I probably wouldn't have left, because I do miss home immeasurably. Sorry, one of my children has just started shouting in the background, but you can probably hear it because of the layout of my house. But it answers some of the questions I see in the chat about balancing, being a woman and balancing childcare and work. And I hopefully we'll get to address that.
Yeah, and even Hazel's point there about sitting in the dining room where Frederick Douglass was. I mean, I'm sure they would never have thought, or maybe it took too long, that someone like yourself will be there with your daughter, getting on with your life, managing all the challenges of work and home, etc. It's a great symbol of change, where you are now and what you represent. Maybe we'll just bring in as well now, Ebun, what do you feel you've obviously worked a lot on this issue of discrimination, of identity, and some of the challenges that in Ireland in particular we're facing. What are your thoughts now that we look back on the visit of Frederick Douglass?
I think, thank you so much again for the invitation, and it's great to be in the company of such amazing women. I think that when we look at, I think for me, I always go back to the idea that narratives are really, really important, because the way the narratives of the past, we're focusing on today. We're looking at the experiences we have today. I'm like, okay, this experience didn't just start today. We need to go back into the past. We need to look at, because there's a quote that says that whoever controls the narrative of the past, they control the present, they control the experiences that we're having today. When we look at the life of Frederick Douglass, when we go back into all of that, we acknowledge that enslaved people were not allowed to read, but we often do not consider how important, that it was a big part of the laws and policies that were enacted with slavery. Why was it so important to prohibit enslaved people from learning how to read and to write? Again, we begin to look at some of that agenda. There is an agenda. We talk about the distortion of history. We talk about the distortion of stories. We talk about how narratives, how stereotypes are passed down. These experiences, for me, we cannot isolate the experience of racism without looking at the impact that the stereotypes that have come in from the past have on us today. When we look at the life of Frederick Douglass, we see the fact that Black people were not, they were punished for learning how to read. They were punished, and it was still if you taught them how to read. But Douglass was taught by women to read. He learned from kids' books. He had some fancy methods to learn from other young people. And what I'm saying is that, so a lot of the work I do is around education. Education is really powerful. Somebody asked in the chat question already about, how can some of all of this work that is being done about Douglass be shown in education? Education is powerful. Anyone that says otherwise is in denial. Because, and I say that to connect with that, that's why I asked the question at the beginning, why it was important, why the enslavement of Black people, the prevention of them getting educated or learning how to read was a big part of all of that. We know that ignorance is not the cause of racism, but education, and not just education, but the right education can make a difference. If not, they would not have outlawed, outlawed it or made it, illegal for Black people to learn how to read. If we look at Frederick Douglass's life, a lot of his success, a lot of the work, we're talking about the strong women, in Ireland, a lot of the work that Frederick Douglass did, a lot of his successes, we can attribute to women. They taught him to read. They did a lot of work, or Hannah, who gave him money to travel, not to go into all of those stories, because I'm sure in the past, 1 week you've gotten a lot of all of that, but we look at the fact that he would not have progressed so much, if all of this work, his ability to read and write did not impact on that. Till today, however, we look at education is still a site of violence against Black people. And this, for me, is very, very important, because whoever is controlling those narratives, what's his name now? Henry Clark, he said something. He said that, history, Henry Clark writes about history, he said that history is a compass which people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. It tells them not only where they are, but also what they must be. And why that is important is that we need to be very mindful of the way history is distorted. If history is distorted, Black minds, not only Black minds, but also all the minds of our people are distorted. And that's how we have racisms, that's how we have stereotypes, that's how we have prejudices, perpetuating and going down over the years. So really important how we learn about history and how we teach that, across the different generations.
Fascinating, Ebun, there about the importance of narratives and role models, in a sense, of what's expected and stereotypes. Mary Robinson, just to come back here, I mean, you mentioned earlier about, you know, the challenges now, and a lot of these are being exacerbated by COVID, and in your own career, which a lot of younger people probably don't know or don't, you know, associate your own legal career and as a human rights lawyer. But this idea that you touched on, that Frederick Douglass himself had worked with suffragettes, that, you know, the idea that human rights, it's not about one issue, it's about many issues. What do you think, what concerns you as we look back now on Frederick Douglass's visit of 175 years ago about the challenges that remain here?
Well, as I was listening, Suzanne, if you'll allow, I actually remembered a request to me as president. I was president between 1990 and 1997. And I got a request to meet with a group, a small group of African Irish women. And I decided to meet with them. Bride Rosny, who ran my life at the time and still does to some extent, in always being the friend who tells you what you don't want to hear instead of what you need to hear, you know. Anyway, Bride arranged that I would meet with this group. And I remember we sat around the table in my official residence, about maybe 10, one 15-year-old. And I particularly remember what the 15-year-old said to me. She said, "Why is it I was born here, and why do so many people tell me to go home to where I came from? To go home to where I came from." You know, and I was quite shocked. This was the Ireland that was opening up, and I had not appreciated the extent of the racism then. You know, it was there. It was quite deeply there, and these women were telling me how difficult it was. And we still have this issue, and that's why, you know, I wanted to mention COVID linking with the intersectionality, because interestingly, a few years later, not so long later, I became High Commissioner for Human Rights, and then I became the Secretary General of the World Conference Against Racism. And I learned so much at that World Conference. I learned in particular about this wonderful feminist word, intersectionality, the links between the different forms of discrimination and abuse and putting people down, that, you know, we need to somehow get out of our silos in this world. And we need to connect the movements of Black Lives Matter, of the young people who are fighting for climate justice, of the Me Too women fighting for justice. You know, these are all, you know, linked. They're all forms of discrimination and putting people down. And we need to make these connections. And, you know, that's what I think will help. I don't like the language of build back better when we come out of COVID, because it's somehow build back. And I don't want to go back. I think COVID has shown us, no, I want to build forward with equity and fairness and, you know, equality and fairness. And it's a kind of building forward into a different way of doing.
Yeah, fascinating. Hazel, did you, I mean, Mary just mentioning there about her, you know, a 15-year-old telling her the story about being told to go back to the country she's from when she was born in Ireland. I mean, have you experienced that as somebody who's been born in Ireland?
I think everyone at some stage, or the various speakers here, perhaps have experienced it when they go to any country and be asked, where are you from? Where are you really from? And then also when you're living in Ireland and born in Ireland, the question is, oh, are you really from here? Or where are you really from when you tell them you're born from here? But I think the more interesting point to Mary's point there is the building forward. And it's funny because she touched on Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and all those groups that connect. Like I still, like up to a couple of weeks ago, I saw a sign outside that said, "Our lives matter," and then other people saying, "All lives matter," until we have proper representation for, and I'm not trying to speak to any of my colleagues here that are Black, but until Black lives are truly mattered and balanced and how will I phrase this? So our put in every mind that they are provided equal and fair status, then it doesn't matter about everyone else. Like, it is the inherent unfairness that started that campaign, inherent injustice. And the fact that people come out with phrases saying, well, our lives matter, or all lives matter, I don't think people understand. And that's what we're trying to build. We're trying to build a fairer and equal and better society. To Mary's point, we're trying to build it forward rather than backwards, because building back doesn't matter, because it wasn't fair to begin with. It wasn't just to begin with. So whatever you build from this point on has to be more equal, has to be more just, but also has to be better represented. So I look at the Oireachtas, and right now there's Senator Eileen Flynn in there, and I was so happy when I saw her nominated, but where's everyone else? So where is the representation there of everyone else? Even on a local council level, we have 22% that are women, but out of that 22%, there is a distinct lack of ethnic minority. It cannot be myself or the Deputy Mayor of Limerick or a Yemi, so that are the only ones. It has to be more. And to Ebun's point, the more you have, the more you make it normal, and the more you allow people to understand that differences are to be celebrated rather than feared.
Yeah, it's absolutely. And when Ebun was talking about role models and narratives and kind of structures of society, you want to keep people down. I mean, we have to, without getting down the political route, obviously, when we're talking about role models, I mean, Donald Trump, when he was president, told 4 members of Congress, one of only whom was born outside Ireland, the other 3 were born in America, to go home to the countries they were from. It was one of those shocking moments in the Trump presidency. So that's acceptable to a lot of people here in America. And, you know, it is, if we're talking about, you know, building a new, learning from a crisis, if you like, Mary's point, I mean, one would hope, for example, Joe Biden, he said that the one reason, there were many things that Donald Trump said that were offensive in his 4 years, but Joe Biden says the moment he decided to run for office was when Donald Trump said there were both good people on both sides during the Charlottesville protest. And that was Joe Biden's moment saying, we are now in a situation where someone is actually sympathizing with white nationalists and white supremacists. And that's why I'm running for president. So, you know, hopefully that is an indication that, and that was before all the Black Lives Matter focus last summer. So maybe there is that sense that that you know, the racism that we saw in parts of America, you know, had crossed the line for so many people in this country too, and it was time for a reset. Emma, I mean, your own experience as well, just to come in here, do you find Britain a bit more, I mean, Britain is much more diverse in terms of ethnic makeup than Ireland is. Do you see a change between living in Britain than Ireland on that level?
Sorry, just unmuting myself. And there's also a moment of relative peace in my house, so that was good timing. I am I'm less concerned with my own like interpersonal experiences of racism, and at the moment more interested in looking at, I'd really like to come back to what Mary was just talking about. So the book that I'm just working on the proofs of at the moment, correcting them, so I'm a bit like haywire, but it's called What White People Can Do Next, but its subheading is From Allyship to Coalition. And I actually look at the idea of allyship as one that is, you know, kind of frames this power dynamic of a white ally helping a Black victim, and you often see the word victim actually used in allyship literature. And I'm thinking about like shifting that framework and moving towards coalition. So for me, identifying points of mutual interest. If we think about intersectionality, if we think about the oppression that so many different types, the oppressions that so many different types of people are subject to under our current global systems, and we acknowledge the differences that exist with those oppressions, but how many of them stem from the same source. And we can identify points of mutuality and shared interest. I think the building of coalitions can be a really powerful way of bringing more people in and counteracting so much of the polarization that we are seeing today. And when I think about Black Lives Matter, and so I think about all of the kind of protests that have happened around the environment and around what's happening in terms of ecology. And I think how that affects all of us to varying degrees, but we are all concerned with the future of the earth and the planet. And I think really interesting new alliances are opened up through the climate crisis, through the ecology crisis. And for me, while acknowledging the specificities of racism and of anti-Black racism, I'm also really interested in cultivating these coalitions of shared interest. And in my new work, I'm really trying to identify those areas of common ground. And one of the things that is one of the many things that's so powerful about Frederick Douglass, who's somebody I'm just, kind of unspeakably inspired by, was that after the Emancipation Proclamation, after Black people were granted freedom from slavery, although we know that discrimination against them continued and continues in many ways. Frederick Douglass continued to advocate for full civil rights for Black people, but also for Chinese immigrants, for women, as we've spoken about. And it was when I was reading about his advocacy for immigrants, for Chinese immigrants, it was really feeling very timely. We have just seen this spate of racist attacks on the Asian community in the United States. And we've seen members of the community saying, where's the solidarity with us? We're experiencing these really kind of horrific attacks at the moment. And then I've seen like a lot of my peers and other Black people saying, yes, we need to also have like solidarity with other people who are experiencing racist attacks. And that's something that is just in the last week, I've seen a lot of discourse around. And then I'm thinking, wow, Frederick Douglass was on that over 150 years ago. It's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, fascinating stuff there. Mary, would you like to come in on that? Emma just picked up on some of your points there.
I kind of wanted to come in, first of all, to tell Emma I loved her book, Don't Touch My Hair. So I'm really looking forward to her next book. But more than that, I actually wanted to say that one of the things you might look at, and you probably are very well aware of this, but I'm very interested. There is a network of trust in our world today, and it actually is women leaders. Mm-hmm. It cuts across everything. I'm involved in several different manifestations of this, if I could put it that way. Fearless women, connected women, dangerous women, and we trust each other. We're in a trusted space. Most recently, I've been co-hosting with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, African and European women coming together to support an African Europe Foundation. We're seamless in actually liking and trusting each other. It's important to know what are the areas of trust, and that's one.
Okay, fascinating.
I was busily scribbling, making notes there.
Someone said in the Q&A, what opportunities for change? That's one of them. You've just pointed out there, Mary, that possibility and what Emma was talking about, those connections, that intersectionality. Ebun, if you'd like to come in here, I mean, it's kind of this idea of you were talking about earlier. I was talking about power structures and the role of education and the stories we see. What kind of, again, it's one of the questions is coming up here, about how do we change education? I mean, all of us, me going to school a long time ago now, there was never even any discussion of racism or any, so is there a role? Do we really have to start from the beginning here or is it, there's obviously changes going on in academia in Ireland, work that yourself, that you've established, but what can people do to try and change the way we think about identity and belonging and those kind of issues?
I think that, thank you so much. I think that one of the key things is that we must go back to education. We need to appeal to education. We need to use education. And I will explain why. Because if you look at it, the only system, the only structure that everyone must go through at one stage or the other of their life is the education system. Some people, you know, it might not happen, but some people are so healthy they would never go to a hospital after the day they were born. You know, some would never go into a church or a mosque or anything. But an education system, every one of us at one stage, at least 99% of us. And so if we really want to change society, if we want to change the thinking, if we want to change the stereotypes, we need to appeal to education system to make those changes. That is one thing. And then when we look at it, so for example, I mean, I started the first Black Studies module in Ireland. And in as much as people say that is amazing, I'm like, okay, it is shocking and it is sad because this happened in 2018, you know, and so we're still having Eurocentric forms of education. We still have young people who are age of 18 who have never been taught by anyone who looks like them. And that the first time they are taught by a Black person is when they come into a third level institution. That is too late. Kataji Wilson talked about the miseducation of the Negro, the Black person. And it comes from the fact that it is only a Black person's education in the Western world that starts with you learning about other people before you learn about yourself. So education is key. And not just from university, from primary school. We talk about difference. It's really about teaching people how to be accepting of difference. In my book, I write a chapter there about how to, you know, we teach about toleration. I'm like, don't teach people to tolerate people. I don't want you to tolerate me or to tolerate my food. There's nobody on this call who came here and say, oh, I want to be tolerated. We all want to be accepted. So if from primary school, we start teaching people to be accepting of difference, that is a key. I mean, in the next few years, we'll begin to see change. So really, really key. And maybe just to quickly comment on that last point by Dr. Mary Robinson, just around the coalitions and allyships and working together. One of the points I was writing, coming in, looking at Frederick Douglass and the women in his life, you know, I look at the way the academy, the books and the work that has been written, they almost pitch all those women against each other. But if you look at it, all of those women, Frederick Douglass always had allies. He had allyship in his mother and grandmother who taught him foundations, taught him to read. He had allyship in his wives who either paid for him or taught him to read or helped him to move out. He had allyships in all the women who helped him to publish, who helped him to do the work. So it's really about getting us to work together rather than pitching strong women against each other. You know, it's about working together, where even when we're doing work, you know, that crosses each other's space, you're making space, you're not taking space. You know, I mean, Hazel mentioned, you know, Black Lives Matter, and I'm not, yes, like, go for it. What if I was not in the room? I need to be sure that if Hazel in the room, she's going to mention Black Lives Matter. So, and that is it, that I don't have to be in the room for it to be mentioned. So while we want representation, I'm just saying that we must all be using our privileges, even when the people are not there. And that's why, you know, we have, you know, when we talk about feminism, that's why Black feminism came out, because Black women felt white feminists were not fighting their corner. So that intersectionality, knowing that I can't unblack myself, you know, you can't unwhite yourself. So how do we make sure that we're speaking for Black women with disabilities, white women with a hijab, or, you know, every woman or everybody, male, female, that we bring all issues to the table?
And there's actually a comment here from Pamela, who makes the point that US white suffragettes excluded Black women from their movement in the early 1900s, and we should learn something about that from that. But this idea as well of role models, and I mean, Mary Robinson, you, I suppose, are an example. You were the first, you know, you're the first woman president, and then a lot of people would say certain people who were born, you know, 1990. I heard an anecdote. Somebody said, some child said, you have to be a woman to be president. That's all they've ever known is a female president. But this idea, I mean, in America, there was a sense that yes, Barack Obama obviously became the first Black president of the United States. But that doesn't, people can use that as an excuse to say, oh, it's fine now, race, race is fine, we've had a Black president. Whereas in fact, you can hide behind that. And in fact, structurally, those issues are still there. And I mean, Kamala Harris's comment after the election that, I'm the first, female Black woman of color to be vice president, but I certainly won't be the last, is the best way to look at that. And just recently, in the last few weeks, I was really shocked. This is just one example. Pete Buttigieg, who was a presidential candidate, she's now being made Secretary of Transportation. And I was writing my article for the Irish Times, thinking, right, he was sworn in as a cabinet member. And I said, well, I couldn't believe it. He's the first openly gay member ever to be elected to a cabinet position in the United States. I was totally shocked by that. And I looked it up, and it's true. Openly gay, he's the first person. He was there with his husband. So, we think sometimes symbols make us feel, or figureheads, that we've come a long way, when in fact, and maybe it's to do with power structures, that, as Mary was saying there, the economic consequences of inequality that are now being exacerbated by COVID, like are where the challenges arrive for society, how to deal with those. Just to come back in here, Nettie. So Nettie, when you're, with Frederick Douglass, looking, if you just kind of come back to Frederick Douglass himself, I mean, were you, when you were brought up and you were saying that, your grandparents, your grandmother in particular, you were very aware of your ancestry. Do you think that it was seen as, as him as a human rights figure rather than just one issue? Were you aware, for example, of his connections with the suffragette movement for women, etc.? Maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Actually, growing up, it was mostly about his abolitionist work, and it was later that I became aware of his work with the suffragists and the women. And it's just so Frederick Douglass. He was all encompassing. And I would like to speak to his wife, Anna, that was mentioned. Anna never learned to read or write. But she was never a slave either, never enslaved. She was a free woman in Baltimore. And if it were not for Anna, we would not be sitting here talking about Frederick Douglass. He may not have escaped. She encouraged him to escape. They met. Okay. She did. They met at an abolitionist meeting in Baltimore. She was a domestic for a family in Baltimore, and they began to fall in love. And it was she who said that if they were to marry, she did not want their children born enslaved. And so she raised the money, she saved the money, she bought his ticket, his train ticket, helped him with his sailor uniform, his disguise. So yes, give her much credit. I have often been asked over the years or overheard conversations about how could Frederick Douglass, the self-educated, never having spent a day in a classroom, love a woman that was unable to read or write. And the first time I heard it kind of really disturbed me, because you're talking about my ancestor, but that was never an issue with him. Not to say that he didn't try to help her learn, and for whatever reason, we don't know. But one thing I will say, she was brilliant with numbers. She knew her math. And when he was in Ireland for the 2 years, he was sending money home to her and expected when he got home that there would be bills to pay. And to his wonderment, she had taken care of all the bills and had every single check he sent her, she had put in the bank, never spent, and raised those 5 children while he was gone for those 2 years. So we owe her, quite indebted to Anna for giving us our Frederick Douglass. And just another thing, just so people know, Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. And I was thinking again last night, I will probably never have this answer. He was the youngest of 5 children, and his mother gave him 4 names. Slaves usually just had 1, and if they had 2, it was usually the slave owner's name. But for some reason, Harriet gave her youngest child 4 names, and I feel it. Maybe she knew something. Maybe she knew if she gave him 4 names, it would help him, inspire him to become someone, or maybe she knew he was going to become Frederick Douglass. I'll never know, but I kind of think that's a neat story. She gave him, his siblings had 2 names.
Wow, fascinating stuff. And just some comments coming in here, which is a very good point. In the United States now, there is a battle about, picking up on Ebun's point, about narratives and the narrative of the American Republic, and the 1619 project that was started by the New York Times, which kind of seeks to kind of reframe the history of America with slavery at the center of it. And of course, there has been a backlash against that at a federal level. The Trump administration, before the end of the administration, tried to change that effectively, and threatened funding withheld from schools who teach it, and it's happening at state level. So there's a whole battle about established narratives of America. They've obviously been constructed by the power structure at that time, and how it's time to kind of revise, a revisionist, I suppose, approach to history and how it's taught. Somebody else, we're talking about this agitate. Somebody's mentioning a lot of the challenges we now have coming out of this global pandemic. And something that's coming up here a couple of times in Ireland is direct provision. Anyone want to come in on that there among our panelists? Ebun, have you? Yes, Hazel, do you want to come in on that, Hazel?
Yeah. We need to get rid of it. So I think plain and simple, we've just had the most horrific reports when it comes to the baby and mother and baby home commission report. We had so much heartache for the survivors and those impacted. And I can't help but think that is what direct provision will be in 20 years' time. So when we look back on it, and unless we change it, and there are plans to change it, but we need to move on it. So from my part, it is a case that the narrative that you talked about, the US government itself trying to change the narrative, there is a distinct shift in narrative here in Ireland. When people have genuine fears and genuine issues like COVID, like unemployment, like homelessness, they will inevitably be brought to blame it on someone. And the narrative from certain groups, especially far-right groups, is that it's immigrants and it's poor people. So, and in this case, they will blame it on people within direct provision. And unless we change that, and unless we eradicate the issue, unless we close down direct provision, that will always be the narrative that people push out, that people are coming into the country, they're coming to take our jobs, they're coming to take our houses, which none of it is true. And and again, it comes back to also the narrative that people are pushing. Now, I would preface this that majority of Irish people are so welcoming, they're so generous, they're so good, and they're not racist. However, there are a minority that's growing more vocal by the day, and they will use terms like Ireland is for the Irish, which is a narrative again being pushed. However, if you look at my office here, there is a proclamation of independence where in the 4th paragraph, there's a very clear line that we cherish the children of the nation equally. So if we're going to push a narrative, that is the one that we should be pushing, that it is that we cherish everyone from all backgrounds equally. And it's not just Ireland for the Irish, it's Ireland for everyone. And including on that then, direct provision must end to provide a more equal Ireland for everyone.
Yeah, so powerful there. I mean, I suppose it does fall though on the public, what Ebun was saying earlier on about, everybody has to advocate for that issue, not just the people in direct provision who actually don't have a voice. So it's about pushing it and people embracing it. I mean, politicians aren't going to move on it if they don't feel under pressure to move on it. And, it's about making a part of the conversation in Ireland that this thing that's happening in the background of many people's lives comes more to the foreground. And that's how, I suppose, activism works, and putting pressure on politicians to make this the issue or one of the issues that it can try and solve whatever during their terms in office. Just a lot of comments here about education and this issue, and maybe in Ireland just a lack of diversity, and about that whole concept. I mean, I've talked about the United States and established stories of the nation, but of course in Ireland we're all taught, I mean, the way the politicization of history, if you like, and how you're taught history, what you're taught. that's hugely influential in how we view ourselves as a nation and a country. And Irishness has always been quite exclusive in a sense. And, you know, we seem to be all agreeing here that it needs to get more inclusive, to include everybody, including different genders, everyone. And, you know, I think education has got a huge part to play in that. Now we're coming towards the end now. And actually, maybe at this point, in a few minutes, I'm going to maybe bring you back in. Just, you mentioned, we were talking about the United Nations, and you were saying that you mentioned the poet Ebun Boland, who died recently. And I was up there myself at the UN. She was speaking up there, and she's a poet, a female poet, who wrote about this intersection between nationhood and, you know, female identity, and where a woman positions themselves in the national narrative. And a lot of women would have felt that in Ireland, up until recently, with a lot of the referenda, etc., that you know, Ireland was excluded from the nation, was not cherished. Women were not cherished in the same way as everyone else, or as men in the country. And Ebun Boland was a poet who really probed that, the complexities of the intersection between nationhood and gender, and how it was quite problematic for Irish women in lots of ways. So maybe, Mary, we were saying you might read some of one of her poems. Maybe you'd introduce it and read it as we start to finish up here.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne. I'd like to do that because this is a panel on strong women, and Ebun was commissioned to write a poem. And I think most poets don't really think their best poems are the commissioned ones, but because it was so much part of Ebun's life, when she and I were students together, you know, we talked about women's rights. On one occasion, she asked me for 7 laws that discriminate against women. And I said, Ebun, why only 7? I said, but that's all I can remember. I could have given her more. But she wrote a poem called, to honor the suffragette movement in Ireland, 100 years from our Irish suffragettes. And it's called, Our Future Will Become the Past of Other Women. And that's worth thinking about. Our future will become the past of other women. And I want to really read the concluding lines because they do speak up Ireland a bit, but I think it's what we aspire to. So let me just read them. Our island that was once settled and removed on the edge of Europe is now a bridge to the world. And so we share this day with women everywhere. For those who find the rights they need to be hard won, not guaranteed, not easily given. For each one, we have a gift, a talisman, the memory of these Irish women who struggled and prevailed, for whose sake we choose these things from their date to honor, to remember, and to celebrate. All those who called for it, the vote for women, all those who had the faith that voices can be raised, can be heard, all those who saw their hopes become the law, all those who woke in a new state flowering from an old nation and found justice no longer blind, inequity set aside, and freedom redefined. She's celebrating what the struggle of other women was that we inherited, that we're lucky enough to have inherited. And in many ways, you know, I think when we talk about strong women, we're on the shoulders of those who helped us. Frederick Davis, as Nettie has said, was on the shoulders of the women in his life as much as anyone else. And I think this is well worth remembering.
Thank you very much, Mary. That's a great sentiment for us to just reflect on as we finish up here. So, we'll start closing down now. Just to finally go to the other panelists. Thank you for that, Mary. Just some closing thoughts from the other 4 panelists we have on this. Emma, I'm going to go to you first. Anything? What would you say to people to take from this conversation we're having now, or what will you take from it? Just unmute yourself. Sorry.
That always helps. Yeah, I have absolutely loads. And as we've seen in the chat, like education has come up many times. Something that I was fascinated in from a young age because of my personal background, but has become kind of a broader professional interest as I've gotten older, are links between like Black American history and Irish history. And on a personal level, I was always fascinated by the fact that as somebody who is of Nigerian heritage and Irish heritage and who loved history, there are very few parts of the world where there are people in Ireland and in Nigeria, where my parents come from. There were very few people that were of the same heritage, mixed heritage as me. The one place where there were people that had the same heritage as me, like West African and European and often Irish, was in the Caribbean and in America. So I always felt like, you know, as kind of a special interest or affinity with those histories. But you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, of this session, this interest in having more Black Americans maybe engage with their Irish ancestry. And something that always, like, something I think about a lot is, I don't know if you're familiar with this book. The title is obviously not very 2021. It's written in the 1800s, but it's Our Nig, or Sketches from the Life of a Free Black by Harriet E. Wilson. It's the first novel published by an African American, and Harriet Wilson's mother was an Irish woman. So there are so many incredibly notable Black Americans who have very direct Irish ancestry. And I think, like, this would be, why isn't this a book? I've never heard of this book included in the canon of Irish literature. And I know it's not straightforwardly Irish literature, but she has an Irish mother. So there's a strong connection, you know? So I think it's about finding those parallels. I also think the history of colonization, you know, between Ireland and the literary movements of you know, the Harlem Renaissance, and the way the Harlem Renaissance was, some of the writers were influenced by W.B. Du Bois, W.B. Yeats. I was writing about Du Bois earlier today. W.B. Yeats. Yeats's influence again on, like, on a African post-colonial writing, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. All of these parallels could be things that were included in the curriculum, you know, and they make so much sense. It's Irish history, but it's just not the narrative that we've chosen to focus on. The one difference, just very quickly, the one difference I think with Ireland's colonialism and other colonized people are the processes of racialization that identified the Irish, that made the Irish white, made the Irish white people. And I think those processes of racialization are also fascinating and will help to shift the narrative if they're mainstreamed. And that's one of the main themes of the new book that I'm writing as well. So shifting narratives, absolutely.
Sounds really interesting. Mary, do you want to come briefly back in there on that for a final comment there? Sorry, just unmute.
That was very interesting, but I'm actually having a time problem at this stage. I thought we were finishing at 9:15, and I have,
yeah, absolutely.
Can I drop out at this stage?
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for joining us, Mary. Okay. Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And Ebun, just finally, some thoughts from you, some final thoughts, again, maybe on this issue of education and narratives. And, you know, that was a really interesting point by Emma there about, like, basic, you know, canon of literature that we need to reassess. But any other comment on you?
Absolutely, and just basic things. Again, you look at, when we look at sociology, we look at the social sciences. Again, I always give out, I'm like, you know, we started by reading about dead white men who were basically very racist and very, very sexist, you know, because don't forget that the foundations of the social sciences were by people who did not think that Black people were human, and they did not think that women had the right to vote or even should have a voice. And so that's the beginning of the social sciences, you know. So again, we need to begin to include people like, you know, Du Bois in that. We need to begin to include people like, you know, Frederick Douglass into that kind of work when we talk about the social sciences. Somebody asked a question in the chat about intercultural art. Now, while I'm an advocate for intercultural art, because I teach Black studies and, you know, I teach Black studies, and one of the tools I use in teaching that, I use films, I use words in films, but you cannot just use the act without the theoretical background. That's where the problem comes. We just do the art. So it's head knowledge. And so there's no transformational change. And so it's like people do a lot of unconscious bias training. You just take people to do. You know, you have to be. So that the lack of the theoretical understanding of all of these things, of race, of racism, where it came from, why it is, how it operates. When you don't have that, when you only just do the intercultural art without the theoretical background, it falls apart. You know, so while I advocate for that, it must be properly done in a structured way where it is, you cannot just learn how to fly a plane and be a pilot. We have to teach you about the plane, how it operates. When you hear the sound, what does it mean? The same thing with difference, how we manage difference, whether it's in sexuality or in race or in gender. We need to get the foundational theoretical basis before we do the doing. So that's my
fascinating. Yeah, lovely, really interesting point to finish on. Lord Mayor Chu, final thought for you. Actually, if you don't mind, I might put a question to you from one of our panelists. You might say it then, which I think is very apt.
Local election one.
Yeah. What would you say to encourage women from minority communities who get exhausted from the backlash experienced when they campaign in local elections?
I was actually going to build this in my summation, is that, listen, to Ebun and Emma's point, there's a lot of what we need to do in terms of education. They've put it quite succinctly. The reason why it's so important in my mind in relation to education is people who are fearful of diversity, who are fearful of the change in status quo. They would normally argue that, well, enforcement's going to come in, hate crime's going to bring in, it's all these things that penalize people. Whereas the education piece and the celebration piece is what I call the carrot. So if you're going to have the stick, which comes with the enforcement side of things, of hate crime, of making sure there's legislation in place when it comes to communications, then there's also needs to have the carrot piece, which most kids in school know, that you celebrate, you look, you don't even see a color, you don't see the issues, you just kind of celebrate with each other. And that's what we need as a society. And that's why we need people to run for local election campaigns or general election campaigns. But it is hard. I'm not going to lie to you, it was really hard. So you have the personal confidence issue of whether people will accept you. This goes back to Emma's point of looking, even I did it myself, look in the mirror of going, well, like, how can I change? But how can I change how people look at me? But I can't change my skin color, nor can anyone else here on this panel, nor should we. And to anyone running for locals, if you're fearful of it because you're fearful of what you would get in terms of your diversity, then I implore you, don't be scared and be thinking of why you're doing it. And a lot of people I know do it for the next generation, do it to show that the next generation that it's okay to be different. It's okay to be different, and it's definitely okay to become a councillor, a senator in the case of Eileen, Lord Mayor in my case. You will get there. I will say to Joanna, if she is interested, drop me an email, lordmayor@dublincity.ie. Love to walk her through a couple of things of how to get involved and run. I think that's really important. It goes down to the whole allyship point, but also just direct mentorship also, and being able to be supportive there of people, which leads me to my final three things. I know you're going to tell me to wrap up, Suzanne. So the final three things is be led by the people who are experiencing racism. Be led by the user. I say this when we talk about homelessness. Be led by the person who's homeless and find out what they need. Be led by the person who's being discriminated against by races and see what they need. So, and together, I think we can challenge the dog whistle that's being pushed out when it comes to the narrative. And there is no such thing as an innocent bystander. I know people want. I know a lot of people say, oh, no, it's not that bad, or someone else will take care of that issue. But no, it's not up to someone else. It's up to all of us. We've spent 4 years saying someone else would take care of an issue over in the States. And next thing you know, there was an insurrection on Capitol Hill. There is no ignoring these things. There's no sweeping under the carpet. Like, Ireland is for Ireland for the Irish. If we're going to use that caption, then I'm Irish. Everyone else who forms roots here builds a home here is Irish. And if that's what we need to build on, then we need to protect those, protect everyone. And that's why there's no such thing as an innocent bystander, and we need everyone to get involved. In relation to direct provision, email your TDs. We may be bringing a white paper in, along, but email them, because we need continuous pressure to make sure we get it over the line. Thanks.
Thank you. That was great. Executive action. You're showing the power of what the can-do power that someone like you in an elected office can actually do. Thanks for that, Lord Mayor. And finally, Nettie, we're going to just hear closing thoughts as we bring this to a conclusion.
Thank you. Well, I would just like to say this has been a wonderful week, and to think that Frederick Douglass brought all of these amazing people together. It's been an honor for me to be on the panel with these wonderful ladies this evening, and I thank you so very much. Excuse me, Suzanne, you were a wonderful moderator. It was so easy to talk to you. And I just want to say, sake of time, I just want to thank everyone who was involved with putting together Douglass Week. You know who you are. You've done a wonderful job, and thank you so much for doing this for my great-great-granddaddy on his birthday. And if you would just let me quickly be a proud grandmother, if I can do this without tears. To see my granddaughter, Nicole Morris, sing with Paul Oakley Stovall the other night has to be one of my highlights. And it's kind of neat that she is making her singing debut in Ireland during this week. So if you happen to have missed the musical night, please go to YouTube and check it out. And again, thank you to everyone. It's just been a perfect week. And happy Valentine's Day to everyone. And happy birthday, great-great-granddaddy.
Lovely sentiment. Thank you, Nettie, for joining us. You are a star.
My pleasure.
My pleasure. Having a direct link, it makes it all the more meaningful and moving actually to have you as part of this panel. So thank you. So with that, I'm going to hand back over to the Douglass Week team just for some closing remarks. The panel now is going to leave you here. So thank you very much for tuning in this evening. Fascinating discussion. Hopefully you've got lots of ideas of what to read and Google and think about from that, or write to your local politician about. But thank you all very much for joining us from wherever you are in the world. Thank you. I'm passing back on to the team now. Thanks.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thanks everyone on the panel. We really appreciate you spending time with us, and really appreciate the conversation and the questions and comments that came in while it was going on. It's been just a fabulous way to end the week. And just Nettie, back to you. A huge thanks to you from the whole Douglass Week team, to you, to your son, Kenneth B. Morris Jr., and also to Nicole Morris, all three of you, key participants in many events during Douglass Week. So we really thank you for making that direct connection, as Suzanne said, and for joining the team. And we look forward to working with you in the future as well.
Thank you. Our pleasure. Speak on behalf of both Kenny and Nicole. Thank you.
I'm just going to jump in to say a word of thanks to a few people. Thanks again to the panel for just an incredible chat. What a way to end the week. We just as a team want to say thanks to all the fantastic organizers, presenters, participants, and team members throughout the week for their generosity, creativity, and knowledge, dedication, and support. We want to thank the support of the US Embassy, the Irish Embassy, the National University of Ireland, and of course University College Cork, specifically the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Science, Equality, Diversion and Inclusion Unit, Schools of Music and Film and English, the Irish Association of American Studies, where incidentally, I think several of us first started talking about Douglass, and Cork City Council. There are a few specific collaborators who also deserve a mention, people during the week who organised more than one event or went above and beyond in one way or another. The Cork Migrant Centre at Nanonago Place, and the incredible creative young people who presented their work during the week. It was just amazing to watch. The Unsilencing Black Voices team of Sandrine and Kathy, who organised two fantastic panels. Stevie G, who brought positive energy to loads of projects. Donald and the Irish Institute of Music and Song. Nikhil Sabu and Paul Oakley Stovall, our Hamilton stars, who just amaze us constantly with their willingness to get involved in everything and just bring their energy and wisdom. Behind the scenes, I want to mention Ellen Whelan for filming, Dan O'Connell, our graphic designer, Dr. Donal Hassett for his practical and moral support, Amanda Sondi in UCC, who opened Douglas Week with a fantastic conversation. And it's just amazing to be able to have kind of rounded out Douglas Week with these two wonderful conversations that had a lot to say to each other, I think. And Aman incidentally suggested we fly the Douglas Week flag over the UCC quad, which was a very nice touch. We also want to say a special thanks to our behind the scenes tech wizard, Emma Baker. I don't know, can we get her on screen for a moment? Is that possible? Emma came on quite late and steadied our nerves enormously with lots of knowledge about Zoom and expertise, and her calm and good humor. So thank you so much, Emma, for that.
Thanks, Tim.
And yeah, finally, on a personal note, I think it's probably a good moment for me to thank the strong women of the Douglas Week team. Yeah, Kristen, Sarah, and Caroline. It's just been incredible to work with these people over the past year and a half. It's been amazing and very gratifying to see this all sort of come together in the past few weeks. And yeah, they've all been amazing to work with. I think it's probably fair for me to specifically mention Dr. Caroline Schroeder, who has just brought phenomenal energy and positivity and vision to this whole project from the beginning. And she is the driving force between so much of what you've seen this week. So thank you all so very much. And yeah, it's been a real pleasure. I'm going to hand over to Sarah to say one or two final things.
Thank you so much, Tim. I just want to echo all the thanks you've just given. And just to say that you can see special projects by each of these collaborators that we've mentioned on our website to get a sense of the range of creativity and generosity that people brought to this whole entire project. Nettie just mentioned Nicole Morris, obviously. We'll also be making most of these talks available to view after the week is over, so keep an eye on our website, our YouTube channel, our social media if you'd like to catch up on anything that you maybe missed. And we really hope that these resources will be useful to people going forward into the future. And while we hope to see many of you who have joined us in person at some point in the future, I think this week Zoom has helped us to overcome social and geographical distance, and we've been delighted to see people tuning in from both sides of the Atlantic as well as from all over the world. And two key words that come to mind when we think about this week are connection and collaboration. And I think tonight it's really been inspiring. Thank you to our panelists. This communal spirit has really carried on. And this is something we hope to continue well beyond the span of 1 week. And now to close Douglas Week, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Caroline Schroeder. And just to echo Tim's sentiment, Caroline is our fearless leader without whom Douglas Week would not exist. So over to Caroline to say the final word. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. First of all, wow. Thank you to all the amazing women here tonight. I could not agree more. Women in leadership and education are the future. So thank you, ladies, for this incredible evening. So we've come to the end of this inaugural Douglas Week. Looking back at the last 7 days, or rather the last year and a half that we've been working on this, it feels improbable still that this has all come together during and despite the pandemic. We're all blown away, I'd say, by the depths of the depth of topics that we've discussed and commemorated during Douglas Week, this last week. Frederick Douglass and his visit to Ireland and all the topics adjacent that have persisted through the last 176 years, and the whole extended Douglass family, they continue to inspire us. They continue to motivate us to continue this journey. They continue to inspire us to keep believing and to keep going. And as we hoped it would, this week has created many new spaces for a beautiful and meaningful conversation, but also for the difficult ones, for the difficult conversations that still need to be had. And I think that we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot together this week, and we're looking forward to continuing to learn from each other and also about each other. And we also look forward to learning about where we're coming from and where we're going together. And we hope that each future iteration of Douglas Week will be more inclusive, even more diverse, and even more creative and even more optimistic. So that's my hope. And We're incredibly grateful, honored that so many people have participated, so many people have contributed to this event series. And we're very proud of the massive creative output. You've seen it, the music, the visual arts, the poetry, the literature, the sports events, all these incredible performances, the workshops, the talks, the conversations from people all around the world, of all ages, all backgrounds. So thank you all for your courage, for your passion, and for your commitment to share your stories with all of us. And my last thank you goes to my incredible team, Kristen, Sarah, Tim, my team colleagues and dear friends, without whom we would not be here tonight. So thank you for everything. And there's a lot of work to be done. So let's do it together. Let's collaborate. Let's create. And we will see you for Douglas Week 2022. Thank you so much and a good night.